Hey fellow babies, welcome back to Pachter Factor on SIFTD.net. If you're a Patreon patron, thank you very much. If you are watching us on YouTube for free, there's instructions below on how to link your Twitch account to your Amazon Prime account. That's $2.50 each time you just click renew. You don't have to do more. Once you set it up, it's an easy click. Thanks if you're already doing that. If you are too lame to figure either of those things out, please follow at Michael Pachter, that's me, at Dinfire, that's Shane, at SIFTD Games, all on Twitter. At a minimum, make us feed our egos, make us feel better about it. Thanks for joining us. Here's our first question from SIFTD, from Paolo Pisatti. Given the recent trade war waged by the U.S. administration against China and others, do you think anything gaming related will see a price increase? Would it impact prices worldwide or just in the U.S.? What would keep software and hardware produced outside the U.S. from becoming more expensive? There's full-priced talent, which is all of Western Europe and all of the U.S. and Canada, and includes Australia, let's say. I mean, there probably are developers elsewhere that I'm missing. But that's one tranche of development skill. So North America, Western Europe, and Australia. The second is Eastern Europe, and I'll include Russia there. Those guys cost about half as much as Western talent. And the skill level, depending upon what they're doing, the skill level could be just as good. So you get guys like CD Projekt Red who make games that are no question just as good as Western European games. They're not paying their people as much. They're paying half as much because they're in Poland. And then the third batch of talent is super low-cost countries like China and India. And no diss on either. They have super educated people, PhDs making games, but they don't have a long history of being creative. So it's harder to rely on them to make like the very best games. So they tend to be doing more of the blocking and tackling functions, like shading and artwork, as opposed to actually creating the stories. And they cost about half or less of what Eastern European people do, so like a quarter. Most game publishers have a little bit everywhere, so they spread the work, and the Shanghai guys do the stuff that low wage labor that they're comfortable they can get it done. Guys like Zynga, all their live ops stuff is in India, because once the game is created, keeping poker working, Indian engineers are as good as they come. Like the CEO of Google is an Indian engineer. They're really good. But the guys in India don't make the same wages as the guys in the US, and they certainly don't make Bay Area wages. So, I think that very much like cars, there's a cost to designing them in China, and so they don't. The world doesn't buy a lot of cars that were designed in China. So U.S. trade war, fortunately for us, both parties in the U.S., Democrats and Republicans, think trade wars are stupid, and both parties think tariffs are taxes, and they are, and they don't like them. We elected a guy who doesn't seem to understand that. So the trade wars in the US are one person and one person only. So PlayStations and Xboxes, I think people misunderstand how they're made. They may be assembled there, but they're not manufactured there. So the components come from all over the place. Like the chipset is from AMD, which is in the US. The cost to make this phone, the actual component cost, is about $120, roughly. The cost, and again, look it up, I'm within $5. The cost to assemble it is about 15. So when you take iPhone manufacturing to Foxconn in China, they get $15. But all the components come from all over the place, and primarily Western, societies that we get along with pretty well. So the Chinese piece of this is $15. Let's go crazy. It's $40 or $50. Maybe some of the other components are Chinese. So what are we going to tax if we impose a tariff on iPhones? Are we going to tax a $1,000 phone or $50 in China? I mean, it doesn't make sense. And if we said, sorry, 20% tax on iPhones because they're made in China, well, if the components in China cost $50, don't you think Apple will move the manufacturer to Singapore or Thailand or Philippines or someplace that we get along with? And maybe the cost will go from $50 to $75, BFD. So a $200 tariff or $25 more in manufacturing costs. It's a profit deal. So we're never going to tax this. Apple works because they make a $150 phone and they sell it for $1,000. And Apple makes the profit and Apple shareholders get the money. Where's Apple? Oh, they're in the US. So is the US really hurt if Apple spends $150 all over the planet to make their phone? So would you really pay a $200 tariff, and I made that up, to move $150 of manufacturing somewhere else? So same thing with PlayStations and Xboxes and Switches. They're made all over the world. They might be assembled in China, but right now I don't think that there's any tariffs on any of those things proposed. I think tariffs go away in a couple of years. There's a reason why we got rid of tariffs. Walmart is able to source the cheapest high quality products possible, so your shoes and your office supplies and your household goods and whatever you buy, furniture at Walmart, and that results in always low prices. And we shop at Walmart because they're able to source all this stuff. If you start adding tariffs to all that stuff, prices at Walmart go up, which means your family can't buy as much stuff unless your wages go up. And your wages aren't going to go up because the money isn't going to your employer. The tariff is going to the government. That's a tax. So the reason the Republicans hate tariffs, and I hate them too, is they are a hidden tax. And the tax is what's called regressive. It means it hits the poorest people the most, because poor people spend a bigger percentage of their income on stuff. If you spend $50,000 a year on stuff and you make $60,000, you're spending 83% of your income on stuff. If you make $100,000, you're only spending 50%. If you make $500,000, you're only spending 10%. So regressive. If you raise the price of stuff, you screw the little guy. So our next question from Twitter from @mgarcia_org. Why is the retro industry so huge? I've noticed this a lot recently with video games, vinyl records, Casio watches, etc. It is a good question. I don't think in games it's as huge as you're suggesting, but I do think it's true about other stuff. We are the wealthiest generation in history, and by we, I mean us old people, not our kids. We are probably the last generation in a while that is significantly wealthier than their parents. And that's been the case in the US for the last couple hundred years. Each generation successively earns a lot more in real dollars than their parents did. Our next generation, our kids, they're saying are not going to earn as much as us. Not materially less, but they're going to be the first ones that don't grow. So what I think you have is an aging population who remembers back in the 60s and 70s and thinks all the retro stuff is cool and we can afford it and we pine for it. At the same time, you're getting technology changes that let us stream old music so we don't have to go buy the albums, let us stream old movies so we can watch old TV shows. The retro thing on watches is fascinating because look at the Apple Watch and then compare it to the first Casios. It's the square block watches. It's fascinating that I think Apple was genius, and I think Apple's design team absolutely knows what they're doing. But you're getting retro designs. What I think is really interesting, and I don't know how to explain this well, I don't want to spend hours on this one, but music, back when I was a kid, and I'm old, I remember that we had the oldies station, and everybody called it Moldy Oldies. And the songs were literally between 15 and 20 years old. So it was like 50s music in the 70s or something. And I remember this. I remember oh my God, nobody listened to oldies. And the music I grew up with was not, at the time it wasn't called this, but it's called classic rock. It's not called oldies, it's classic. So my 18-year-old daughter knows the Beatles and Led Zeppelin. That is so weird to me, that my daughter knows 60s and 70s and early 80s bands and is all over them and listens to them all the time. So something happened between when I was a kid and we thought oldies 15 and 20 years older was our parents' music and was uncool, and is happening now when our kids think their parents' music is really cool. You know, back in the 70s, the production processes for film and movies and TV just got better, and things just got better acted, better scripted, and there's nostalgia for that. So that's the truth with games too. I mean, we can argue about whether Pong would still be fun. I personally think it would be. So, you know, the retro gaming consoles are taking advantage of the fact that a lot of us came of age in the 80s and 90s. We played games at, 10 years old in the 80s and 20 years old in the 90s. And now we're in our 40s and 50s and we really want that retro stuff. And we want to share it with our kids. There are fathers who grew up playing Nintendo and mothers and who want to play that stuff with their kids. So the answer is, I think that we have a throwback, nostalgia for stuff that we loved as a kid. And, I think if you ask any gamer over 40 what's their favorite game of all time, almost none of them are going to say Red Dead Redemption or Grand Theft Auto. They're going to say, NHL on the Sega Dreamcast or something. It's going to be something like that. And I think most of us, is like the first time we played a real Mario game, we were like, oh my God, this is just incredible. So, or Zelda. My God, Zelda Ocarina of Time. Somebody asked me, Red Dead came out, this is the week Red Dead came out, and somebody asked me if a 96 Metacritic score is the highest of all time. And I said, no, there's probably been 5 or 6 games that got a 97 and one that got a 98. And the guy's like, what was the 98? And I go, Ocarina of Time. And he goes, best game ever. 40-year-old guy. But yeah, it's like, who didn't love that game? And I don't know how that stands up. Like, if I played Ocarina of Time now, would I think it looked junky and pixelated and stupid? Next question from SIFTD from Zero Kaiser. If game streaming tech becomes a thing, will the big three, Sony, Nintendo, Microsoft, be replaced by Google, Apple, Amazon? Will companies like Valve create their own streaming services? No, they won't be replaced. Content is king. So streaming became a thing on movies. Did Disney and Fox and Warner Brothers go away because Netflix is thriving? No. Netflix needs their content, or Netflix doesn't have anything. Now, can Netflix create its own content that is on par with them? Sure. It'll take them years to get the quantity that the other guys produce, and will take them billions and billions of investment. So Netflix is on that path. But it's hard to predict that Google, Apple, and Amazon are going to make games that are as good as what EA, Activision, Take-Two, UB, Nintendo make. I don't think so. And the question is, does Sony, Microsoft, and Nintendo go away? Sony makes pretty good games. Microsoft makes pretty good games. Not as many of them, but they have content. So they'll thrive as long as they have content. Nintendo obviously has a shit ton more content and will thrive. So I don't see it. I could see maybe an Apple or Amazon buying one of these guys, in which case then they'll exist in a different ownership form. But I think that the content owners are going to keep pumping out great content, and if they're smart, they'll pump it out for all platforms. So Nintendo's going to have trouble thriving in this thing. Sony could go away and Microsoft could go away, but Activision and EA are going to keep producing content for whoever will make them the most money. So more competition on the hardware front or on the streaming front is really good for the guys who have content. And think about movie studios, 75 years ago, theatrical exhibition only. If you didn't buy a movie ticket, you never saw their movies. 75 years later, theatrical, commercial broadcast television, VHS was turned into DVD, premium cable services like HBO, and then pay-per-view first, then video on demand, then finally streaming on a Netflix. That's 7 different places to sell you the same content. And they're all making more money now than they're making in the 1940s, by a lot. And in real dollars, I mean, they're making like 4 or 5x what they're making because the audience grows. It used to be, 50 million people saw a movie in the theater in the 40s. Now, how many people saw Avatar? 1 billion, I'm sure of it. So you really get a giant increase in the number of people. Our last question this week from YouTube from N64 Danny. Why do you think Sony hasn't announced the rest of the games to the PlayStation Classic? Is it to keep Nintendo in the dark? Is it legal to take pre-orders if Sony were to include M-rated games without announcing them? Will it only have T-rated games or lower? There's no legality about putting M-rated games on the console. The legality, which is, by the way, a self-imposed rule, the ESRB puts ratings on and retailers voluntarily comply. They're not required by law to comply. There's a U.S. Supreme Court case which turned into Schwarzenegger versus the Entertainment Retail Association, but it was Brown first. Schwarzenegger first, then Brown. Those are the governors. That said, you can't force retailers not to sell M-rated games to kids. They can, they just don't do it. So no, there's no legal anything issue. Sony is going to put only T-rated or lower titles, more likely E-rated or lower, or only E-rated titles on their retro console. Because what's the point? They want people. We're talking about a price point, of like $50 or $100. They want people to buy these and hook their kids on PlayStation games, and then buy a PS4, and then buy whatever games are age appropriate for their kids. So this is an intro model. I think it's $80. I think this is an intro model to getting a full-fledged console. Why haven't they announced it? Because I think they're still kind of scrambling to figure out the system requirements and the storage requirements, because essentially it's all on flash. So they're just trying to figure out, do we put in 32 or 64 or 4? What do we put in there? 4 gigs probably cost them, $1, and 32 gigs probably cost them $10. So they're just trying to figure out how much storage do we need, how many games can we pack in there. They're probably also deciding, do we want to do Sony PlayStation Classic 1, Sony PlayStation Classic 2, PlayStation Classic 3, and put 20 games in each one, or 50 games, or 100 games. They're just determining how much they need to put in to get people to buy it. So the answer is they haven't announced everything because they're still figuring it out. Nintendo has nothing to do with it. Nobody cares if Nintendo knows or doesn't know. It doesn't change what Nintendo does. Yes, it's legal to take pre-orders that they include M-rated games. But again, Sony's not planning on making a ton of money on this. They sell 20 million PlayStation 4s a year at probably $50 of profit per or more, maybe more. That's $1 billion of profit. How many of these $80 consoles are they going to sell? 5 million at $25 profit. It's not a rounding error, but it pales in comparison. They much rather convert a $80 retro console purchaser into a $250 PS4 purchaser, and that's the way to hook them on PlayStation games. So I think it's really more of a marketing ploy. They will certainly make money, but they're not going to make billions of dollars on this thing. And I don't think they're going to sell 25 million or 100 million of these things a year. They'll be lucky to sell 5 million a year. Okay, that's it for Pachter Factor. Thanks for joining us. We hope you are a Patreon patron, or if you're watching on YouTube, we hope you click the link below. You linked your Twitch account to your Prime account. Once you set it up, it's a click. Do it every month. Shane can afford to eat if you can do this every month. If you can't figure out either of those, follow @Dinfire, @SIFTD Games, @Michael Pachter on Twitter. And I actually will answer questions if you're civil and you're polite and you're nice to me on Twitter. So thanks for joining us. We'll see you next week. So here you are a couple of years in. You tried your blended Dewar's, then you moved up to Glenlivet, then you moved up to Glenfiddich, then you tried the Aberlour, Balvenie, or Dalmore. Those are the 3 best $40-ish whiskeys. Then you started trying all the flavored ones and you found stuff you wanted. Then it gets more nuanced. So everything I've said so far, 12 years and younger, the next thing you're ready to do after you've spent $50 to $65 on the flavored whiskeys is find a brand that you like and try the 18. Now, the interesting thing about 18-year-old whiskeys is they are not cheap. So I used to drink Glenlivet 18. It was literally about $60. It's about 90 now. Glenmorangie 18 is between 95 and 110. Oban 18 is about 110. So you're talking $100 for an 18-year-old. And I would suggest you find one that you like at 12 and then try the 18. Macallan 18 is prohibitively expensive, unfortunately. Macallan 12 is about 45 or $50 a bottle. Macallan 18 is like 170, so it gets really expensive. But find an 18, and the Glen Moray 18, there's one called Glendullan, Glendullan. Try that one. That one's about $60. And it's the difference in flavor is amazing. That extra 6 years takes out all of the harshness and makes the whiskey just phenomenal. And so, again, I'm not asking you to go spend all of your paycheck on whiskey, but I would drink one bottle of 18 for every 3 or 4 of 12s that you try. So if you got a bottle of 12 lasting you for 3 weeks, every 9 weeks you go through 3 bottles of 12-year-old Scotch. Then the last 3 weeks, buy 1 bottle of 18. So I'm suggesting you buy 1 bottle a quarter. Don't go crazy, don't OD, and change them up. Try different 18s. Now, I will tell you honestly, there are no bad 18s. They're all great. It's something, it just magically happens after the whiskey is aged. So try a lot of them. My favorite is probably Glenmorangie 18, and just to give this a video game flavor, I went to the Bethesda press event at E3, and it was like a Sunday night. And Bethesda was very kind. They invited me to like a little cocktail party with all of the guys on stage, and with the CEO of ZeniMax, Robert Altman, and Wonder Woman was there, his wife Linda Carter. And then we sat in a little VIP section, and they had a little VIP party. And funny thing about the VIP party, Vince Zampella wasn't invited, and I saw him outside, and I dragged him in as my guest. So he was in there. Anyway, I go up to this little VIP party. The party itself was for everybody who went to the press event. So there were 2,000 people at this party. It was in a big tent. But the VIP section only had like 100 people. And they had whiskey and vodka and stuff, and the whiskey was Glenmorangie 18. And I went up to the catering guy, and I go, "You guys pour that for parties here?" He goes, "No. This was specifically requested by the party sponsors." So I went and found, who is it, Tracy Thompson? Yeah. So I dragged Tracy, and I go, "Who did this? Did you do this? Because this is great whiskey." And she goes, "No, that's Mr. Altman's favorite whiskey." So Mr. Altman and I have that in common. And I actually saw him a couple of days later. I didn't do it at the party. I saw him at E3, and I told him I was so impressed. And he goes, "Look, I would never pour anybody something I wouldn't drink myself." So if you want to be like the president of ZeniMax and me, drink Glenmorangie 18. It's really great.